JD Vance, quite an extraordinary speech about, well, Britain, really.
Yes, we're still trying to work out how to think about JD Vance. A lot of people here know him from his extraordinary memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, about growing up white and poor in a kind of drug-ravaged community in the Appalachians. And he has been seen right across the board by, writers and politicians of the left as well as the right as an exceptional talent when it comes to that. But bit by bit, he has been moving towards Trump. He started as an anti-Trumpian, described Trump famously as America's Hitler, and yet, despite that, has been able to kiss the ring and grovel enough to get this extraordinary tip as vice presidential candidate.
The ultimate shapeshifter.
The ultimate shapeshifter. More traditional anti-MAGA Republicans like Mitt Romney absolutely loathe Vance. And he certainly seems quite loose with what he said. He was discussing Britain most recently. And the conversation, as I recall it, went along the lines of, this was at a National Conservatives conference he was talking, and he said, well, we were discussing what's going to be the first Islamist country to have nukes. And we thought, will it be Iran? It could be Iran, or maybe Pakistan. Maybe Pakistan's included. And in the end, we thought, no, it's Britain, because they've just elected this Labour government.
It's difficult to work out how he's come to that conclusion, but parking that, how on earth does this Labour government respond to that kind of rhetoric? And were Trump to win in November, which is looking increasingly likely, how are they going to deal with a Trump presidency?
Well, they're going to have to start to dial down their own rhetoric first if they want an agreement, an arrangement with the Trump administration. Actually, the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who has been frequently to Washington trying to build bridges with the Republicans around Trump, has been speaking to, I think, JD Vance himself. So there is some kind of connection there. How effective or creaky it will be, we don't yet know. But David Lammy has been tweeting quite aggressively about Trump recently as well. And I think on both sides we have to be very, very careful about the language we use. Because one thing we know about Trump, this is a man who never forgets.
Were you surprised at all by the choice of running mate? I mean, some people had wanted Trump to pick Nikki Haley, who obviously ran against him and failed, but to try and broaden the appeal of the Republican ticket. Are you surprised that he's gone for someone who shares all of his views, well, for the time being at least, and is even more extreme?
No, I'm not, because I think this is one of the outcomes of the failed assassination attempt we can talk more about later. I think this emboldens him. You can see in the polls he's already creating even more space between him and Joe Biden. I think he feels very, very confident and therefore not in a position where he has to, as it were, widen his appeal further. He doesn't need that. And we know that he wants to come in and do a second presidency much more aggressively than the first presidency. Get rid of all those people who are the guardrails, the human guardrails around him, urging caution or think again or think thrice or whatever it might be. He wants people who are with him. He wants to, sack the senior diplomats and senior members of the civil service in Washington and replace them with MAGA Republicans in his image. So it's not at all surprising that he wants a vice president in his image as well.
I mean, certainly those attending in Milwaukee will be Trump supporters anyway, but the response he received following the assassination attempt, it was almost messianic, wasn't it?
Very, very close to messianic. There's lots of images of Christ lifting him away from the shooting. And there are even reports of people collecting tiny little samples of his blood and selling it as a healing balm in a kind of, here's Christ's blood kind of way. The level of adulation now of Trump is extraordinary. And I think he has realized that this has taken him to a new place. Quite how he's going to respond, we don't know until we actually hear his speech. And there were indications initially that this might produce a more healing, more kind of consensual Donald Trump. Strange idea, though that might be, to the extent that he was talking about Americans standing together against evil. And Melania Trump was saying, we have to start to think about the days when we go beyond left and right, when we go beyond blue and red, which from anyone in the Trump family is quite something. But I think the appointment of Vance squashes any thought that there is somehow a more consensual, gentler Donald Trump in the wings.
This week's magazine, understandably, we're having a Trump special, and you've written a feature about assassination and whether or not these ever work, but you start in really quite a dark place.
Well, I'm sorry, but it's a thought that I think has been thunk by liberals all around the world, which is, what if the bullet had just gone very, very slightly to the left, or if Trump hadn't turned his head at that time? The prospect of a second
had that thought, I have to say.
prospect. Well, I think a lot of people have a
Yeah.
prospect of a second Trump presidency, which is an existential threat to NATO, to Western security, and certainly to Ukraine, would have gone. And I think I mentioned that because I think that is the essential context to make the argument against assassination, to argue that assassination almost never works, almost never produces the results that the assassin expects, and in many ways produces perverse and dangerous results. In this case, it'll be the massive victory, I suspect, of Donald Trump in the November election.
What would have happened had it been successful? I mean, we can only guess, I suppose, but...
I think the fundamental error that the sort of assassination idea makes is to conflate a single human individual with tyranny or oppression or some big political problem. All of those things are created by massive social and economic forces. They are the surrounding architecture in which tyranny or authoritarianism or simple bullying can take place. I think, successful, economically prosperous, well-protected, healthy democracies do not throw up tyrants. Societies in deep crisis, as America is, as most European societies in different cases are as well, do produce tyrants. And simply think, I'll take that tyrant off the chessboard, does not actually change the game very much.
But you're very careful not to compare Donald Trump, who has been democratically elected in the past, he's been chosen by his party now, to the likes of, the most heinous individuals in history, the likes of obviously Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. I mean, he's not, is he? He's not that.
No, he's not. But I think the comparison is only interesting when you make the case against assassination, because, the most cliched argument for assassination would be, you're sitting in the Osteria Bavaria in Munich in the early to mid 1930s, and the little man with the moustache comes in for his plate of trout, and you have a revolver. Do you do it or not? And I think most people would say, if I had the courage, I hope I would. But of course, if you took Hitler out of the 1930s Germany at that point, you don't get rid of anti-Semitism, which is deeply rooted in that society. You don't get rid of the profound middle-class paranoia caused by hyperinflation and the extremism. You don't get rid of the Nazi Party, which is already created a form of authoritarianism that is very hard to fight back against. All of those things are still there. So you might get another leader to replace the martyr Hitler, but another leader who perhaps, I suggest, might not have made the egregious errors that Hitler himself did, might not have turned against the Soviet Union until Britain had been finally defeated to the West, or might not have turned against the Soviet Union at all, and therefore, rather like Robert Harris's novel Fatherland, might well have still been in power by the 1960s.
I mean, it's extraordinary because, intuitively, as someone who lost extended family in the Holocaust, and I'd think, you take out Hitler and then perhaps it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I'm taking the most obvious example for a reason. But of course, there are many, many more. Gavrilo Princip, who killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, famously in Sarajevo, in 1914. What he wanted was a South Serbian republic or monarchy outside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He didn't want the First World War. And, and even the famous assassination or killing of Kirov, Stalin's great rival and friend in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, I should say, in 1934, produced was the trigger for Stalin's Moscow trials and the Great Terror. So if that assassination was meant to be a protest against the authoritarian and brutal tendencies of Bolshevik Russia at that time, it made things worse, not better. I just use these examples because again and again
well, you never
and
know
again,
what the consequences
it's
are
a
going to
perverse
be.
consequence. And the same applies, by the way, I think, to American democracy when you look at the effect of the assassination of Martin Luther King or of Lincoln or of Kennedy and so on.
What have you made, we discussed it at length yesterday, but what do you make of the Republican line of attack that the assassination attempt was in part at least because of the rhetoric used by the Democrats and referring to Donald Trump, in negative terms, that they've somehow incited this act of violence?
I think they have a point. I think Donald J. Trump Jr., Trump's son, when he said this was caused in part by people on the Democrat side who say of my father, he is literally the same as Hitler. If you think that Trump is literally the same as Hitler and you're a young guy with a gun, that makes it much more plausible that you'd have you'd try and take a pop at him. I mean, those of us on this side of the Atlantic would point out that this is a country with more guns than people and a long history of political violence that goes all the way back to the beginning of the Republic. It's not a normal democratic society, and that is also part of the story.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know much about the shooter, but it seems at least that he wasn't, a Democrat supporter. So we don't really know. But I mean, it just seems ludicrous you're right, to compare Trump to Hitler.
I think where they have a point, you see, is that language really matters. That old thing about sticks and stones will break my bones, but words won't ever hurt me, is wrong. Words become sticks and stones if they're sharp enough and they inflame passions enough. They can turn into sticks and stones or bullets. And therefore, I think we all have to be very, very careful, including in our political culture, about the words and the language we choose for people we disagree with.